Hello, everyone. Welcome. If you have a chance, please let us know where you're tuning in from. As you're coming in, just please let us know where you're watching us from, and then we'll get started as soon as we have enough people. We're about halfway there. Looks like we have someone from New Jersey, Kansas City as well, London, Kingston, New York. Still waiting for those numbers to climb. There's someone all the way from the other coast, Oregon. Well, as people are coming in, I'll just go ahead and start my introduction. Hello, I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum here in Hartford, Connecticut. And I'm delighted to host tonight's program, The Grimkes, A Legacy of Slavery in an American Family. The Mark Twain House and Museum's virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring Frank Lord, a beloved trustee of the museum who passed away a few years ago. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs. We are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting this and our other virtual programs. We would also like to thank the Amistad Center for Art and Culture. Their extraordinary collection documents the centuries of the artistic, literary, military, enslaved, and free life of Blacks in America. In addition to the care and development of their collection, the center preserves and interprets African-American culture and history and corrects the misrepresentation and underrepresentation of this important aspect of our country's evolution. Now let me introduce our guests. We are welcoming Kerri K. Greenidge, for a discussion with our very own Erin Bartram about Kerri's new biography of the most important multiracial American family of the 19th century, the Grimkes. Our author, Kerri K. Greenidge, is a historian at Tufts University and the author of Black Radical, The Life and Times of William Monroe Trotter, winner of the 2020 Mark Linton History Prize, among other honors. Our moderator is Erin Bartram. She has been the school programs coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum since 2019. She earned her PhD at the University of Connecticut in 2015 and taught for 3 years at the University of Hartford before joining the museum. Now, we encourage you to have a conversation in the chat. If you have any specific question, you can post that directly into our Q&A section. You can do that at any time. Please also know that you can click on live transcript to see live auto captioning of this event. So that's all from me. Please sit back and enjoy. And over to you, Kerri and Erin.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Omar, and thank you, Kerri, for being here with us tonight. I'm glad to see so many familiar faces in the chat. And I'm looking forward to a great discussion about a really spectacular and beautifully written book. Here I have my copy right here. Oh, it'll blur it out. There it is. So I just wanted to start, Kerri, with kind of tell us what the book's about and tell us kind of what prompted you to engage in what can really only be said to be an incredible work of historical labor to put this together.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me, Mark Twain House. This is wonderful. So I was really inspired to start researching the Grimkes because I had grown up, like I'm sure many in your audience had, about this myth of the Grimke sisters. The Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, the sort of outlines of their lives are that they were born into one of the wealthiest slaveholding families in the low country of South Carolina. Their father was a designer of South Carolina's Constitution and a veteran of the Revolutionary War. And as the story went that I had been told both in graduate school and just as somebody who was a history nerd was that, you know, the Grimke sisters disavowed their birthright in terms of slaveholding, made their way to Philadelphia, joined the Quaker faith, or became involved in the Quaker reform movements of the 1820s, and eventually became leaders in women's rights. Angelina became the first American-born woman to speak before a state legislature when she spoke before the Massachusetts legislature in the late 1830s. And both of the sisters published iconic texts of the anti-slavery movement of the 1830s. By the late 1830s as well, Angelina married a fellow radical abolitionist, Theodore Weld, who had basically spread the word of abolition and reform and radical equality throughout what was then called the burnt over district in New York. And I saw some of the attendees are from upstate New York. So he was sort of one of those, the pioneers of that movement. And so that was the story I had heard in history books. And then in my own reading of African-American history and researching my previous book, I came across the Grimke brothers and their story that they were born enslaved to the white Grimke family, that the two brothers, Archibald and Francis, called Frank, and Archibald called Archie, made their way from enslavement to the North, where they were discovered, or so the story went, by their white aunts, and those aunts, Angelina and Sarah, paid for their tuition to both Lincoln University and for Archie to attend Harvard and Frank to attend Princeton. So this was a story I had always heard, and the story kind of ended there. And then depending on which scholars you were talking to, you heard about Archie's daughter, the very famous, very gifted, prolific Harlem Renaissance era poet and playwright Angelina Weld Grimke. And so that was the story I heard, was that these two stories were separate, right, in a lot of the conversation. And also that the Grimke sisters, because they were seen as these founders of women's rights, that they had sacrificed themselves for their nephews. And that was kind of the story that I came through. And as I started to explore the Grimkes as a whole, I started to see all of this evidence that there was a difference between the myths and the stories that the Grimkes, both Black and white, told about themselves, and the realities that was pretty evident in the historical record. And so I was really concerned with two things. The first was, what does it mean to have this legacy of enslavement? And as that legacy continues over generations, what are the stories that families tell themselves? And kind of that's a microcosm of what communities tell themselves about enslavement and its legacies. And the second thing I was really interested in is, what are the long-term effects of this being part of this community of African-American people who were the children of white slaveholding men and enslaved Black women, right? And that was a group of Black leaders at the end of the 19th century, once slavery ended. And so what did this mean to them, that this was where they came from? And what does that say about elitism? What does it say about colorism? What does it say about class? What does it say about the shortcomings of white reform movements of the 19th century? What does it say about the very sort of project of radical abolition in the mid-19th century? So those were the sort of main overarching themes that I was very interested in looking at them. I would also say that I was very interested in this idea that somehow white abolitionists, particularly white abolitionist women and women's rights activists, joined this struggle and were able to and conscious of shedding many of their racial ideas that they were inculcated in and grew up in as slaveholders in the South, right? This has kind of been our narrative as a country as well, right? That, somebody is raised in slavery, and look at the Grimke sisters, they were able to disavow the racial system in which they were born. And I just the historical evidence that I found in this particular family, that was really something that weighed upon their relationship with all the Black people they came in contact with, and particularly with their nephews, even as the Grimke sisters supported their nephews financially in their later years.
Yeah, there's so many. I see someone from Torrington, from John Brown's hometown in here, who then obviously ends up in the burned over district himself. There are so many deep and rich connections, and this book focuses mean, I suppose theoretically on the solidly 19th century, but it really draws from the revolution forward. And I think one of the strongest themes, that the more I think about it, the more places I find it in the book, are the kind of dimensions of inheritance and rejection of inheritance. So from the very kind of the challenges of generation to generation. What do the children of activists do? How do they accept or reject the inheritance of money, of the you know the money piled up as the result of enslaved labor, and then who is that brought to? The very strange ideas of cultural and genetic inheritance that start arising, particularly later in the book. But one of the things I thought was really kind of most striking was these ideas of who gets to inherit freedom and autonomy, and who has to continue to fight for it, not just generationally, but individually.
Yeah.
Who gets to inherit the freedoms of the revolution, and who has to prove their worth. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how inheritance sort of shapes this narrative.
That's an excellent question. I think that as you pointed out, the inheritance of, for instance, the revolutionary spark in the late 18th century, the idea that you have republicanism, little r, that people are born with certain inalienable rights, and who got a right to automatically be assumed underneath that banner. And for the Grimkes, the white Grimkes at least, this was something that they never would have questioned. And the Grimke sisters, in their sort of brilliance as orators, was their ability to tap into that spirit in order to make the claims for women to have equal rights and for the emancipation of the enslaved. The inheritance of that kind of late 18th century revolutionary moment, however, was very much contested when it came to African-American people, and particularly African-American people who I talk about a lot in the book, who lived in places that were nominally free, Pennsylvania, for instance. So Francis Grimke, the Black nephew of the Grimke sisters, married Charlotte Fortin, who is a very famous African-American woman, who's the daughter and descendant of the wealthiest Black sailmaker in Revolutionary era America named James Fortin. And she was born in Philadelphia. She was already living in Philadelphia when the Grimke sisters sort of made their names in that city. And one of the fascinating things to me was that the Grimke sisters arrived in Philadelphia, and they really very boldly proclaimed, that they are adopting, embracing these inalienable rights and interpreting them and demanding them for women and for the enslaved. On the other hand, the society in which they lived in antebellum Philadelphia was immensely violent towards the Black community that lived in its midst. Didn't know how to deal with the fact that Philadelphia had one of the largest and growing free Black populations, and that population had been there since, the start of Pennsylvania. And what did that mean? That many of those Black people in Pennsylvania were both enslaved and free. And then the Grimke sisters stepping into this reform movement in the 1820s at a time when Black Philadelphians had been claiming that revolutionary spirit since, at least the 1760s and 1770s. And so what did it mean that the Grimke sisters arrived in 1820s and they're proclaiming and claiming this legacy of the revolution? And yet in their mind, they could not conceive of, I argue in the book, the fact that the Black community that they encountered in Philadelphia had been shaping and thinking about and analyzing that revolutionary spirit for well over a generation, right? And so the first part of the book is this relationship or lack thereof that the Grimke sisters have with the Black community that they're determined to save, right? And one of the questions I had was reading over the historical record was, well, what did it mean that the Grimke sisters arrived with this vision of inalienable rights, right? And that were very radical at the time because they're talking about women, they're talking about emancipation. But what did it mean that they could not see that they are living in basically on the edges of the Black community in Philadelphia. And the people who are leading that movement at the moment they get there are Black women, right? How could they relate to the Black women they encounter? And I go through in the book, they have a very difficult time with that, right? The fact that they have Black women, particularly the Fortune family, who were very seasoned activists, worked on the Underground Railroad, were women's rights activists, automatically linked the emancipation of the enslaved to the emancipation of women, but they wanted Black women to kind of be at the center of that. And so when you're talking about kind of legacies and who has the right to a certain legacy, from the beginning of the book, I really wanted to look at what does it mean that in one single family and also over generations, there's constant contestation about what that legacy means and what it actually means to have reform, or even further, kind of this revolutionary notion of rights and freedoms.
Yeah, and I had, by the end, we're really talking about sort of explicit liberation conversations where, and I thought one thing I thought was really wonderful was the way it emphasized right from the beginning what the stakes are in Philadelphia in particular, and that while we may think of the kind of distant yet strangely intimate violence of the plantation, we're talking urban violence in Philadelphia. And I had known the famous story of the hall being besieged and all of this kind of stuff, and the scandalous wedding that had happened. But what I found really interesting was that the number of these moments of violence, either physical or almost emotional violence, that happen in response to often free Black people who were born free, exercising autonomy. Whether that meant, I believe in the first one you mentioned, the exercise of autonomy was to resist the colonization movement, the supposed back to Africa, we're going to send, and you're pointing out, mentioning numbers of these families where the original ancestor who had been kidnapped to the colonies had come, as part of the holy experiment, had been in Pennsylvania since the beginning of colonization. And then another one of these riots was in response to sort of Black celebration of West Indian independence. And I wondered if you could talk a bit more about the ways that when Black individuals, relatives, communities refuse to sort of act as objects for white redemption, things really went off the rails, to put it mildly.
Yeah, and that's a good way of putting it. I mean, it was one of the things I was really curious about and examined and kind of used the Grimke family as an example of is this notion, particularly in the antebellum era, of many white reformers really sincerely believing that obviously that slavery was a sin, sincerely believing that Black people needed to be free, sincerely dedicating their lives to that cause, but also sincerely having a disconnect that Black people could be more than, that image of the kneeling slave who's, am I not a man and a brother, that famous image that the abolitionists used as a form of political mobilization, and so it's very different to see a group of people or a person as a cause, as opposed to seeing them as a political, personal being who might not agree with your political strategy, who might talk back to the way that you are processing the meaning of enslavement and freedom, who might have, not interact with you in the way that you as a white reformer had experienced before. And so the Grimke sisters really were an example of that. They had a very difficult time of countenancing and dealing with Black people once Black people were more than a cause, right? And had a very difficult time seeing even the Black people who their family owned, who they had a lot of sympathies for, and two of whom they facilitated the passage to freedom of seeing them as like individual people, right? And so my then concern was looking at, well, then if that's where they are at the moment, and when they get to Philadelphia, what did it mean that they arrive in this city of Philadelphia, where the whole city in the antebellum era often reacted, as you're saying, to just Black people being, and having a very, very strongly independent, politically active, autonomous, Black community had at one point 6 different churches of their own that they ran, their own school system that they ran, the Fortin sisters ran, very, very their own businesses that they ran, and white people really be acting in violence to the fact that that Black community existed, right? And so what you're pointing out is, the first riot that I opened the book with happened because this thing that happened all the time, which is that Black working people and white working people will go to this Ferris wheel or this merry-go-round and hang out. And something happened at that Ferris wheel that particular day, and the white attendees attacked the Black ones, and that turned into an almost week-long, orgy of violence in which the Black community was literally burnt to the ground and people were killed, right? And that kept on happening. And the Grimke sisters were in the city at the time that happened, living, and I charted this with my little maps, 2 blocks away from where the worst violence happened. And yet they never mention it, right? In all the copious and very detailed diaries that they kept about Philadelphia. They never ever mentioned any of this violence. And so I really was looking at, what did it mean that they can't, it was as if they couldn't countenance the fact that they're in a place and in a system in which there's a through line from the slavery and violence they experience as slaveholders in Charleston to the life that they experience when they're reformers in Philadelphia, and really not making the connection for people who were so involved in the struggle. That was something that was very, very difficult for them. And then conversely, the Black community, how do they deal with having to or working with these activist women who they had a lot of respect for, but who they were often talk about them not really understanding, the white Grimke sisters, the nature of the struggle, and them not really understanding the Black community at all, right? And having very sort of derogatory ways in which they interacted, particularly with Black women in the community. And then what are the legacies, not to use that term too much, what are the legacies of that across generations, this constant inability to see Black people as people?
Yeah, and just as you're talking, I'm thinking more about this this idea of disavowal that is sort of central to that myth, and that we do at times see people in here sort of disavowed by their families, Sarah Stanley, but that the Grimkes, Angelina and Sarah, are very much able to decide the terms of that disavowal at any given moment. So, you mentioned them, and I had always sort of understood it. The framing is that it is important that Angelina marries and withdraws and maintains her respectability. And just for anyone interested in Twain, her husband, obviously very famous orator, Presbyterian, speaks to this gathering of Presbyterian ministers. One of them is the minister at the Presbyterian Church in Hannibal, where the Clemens family attends. He is changed, altered, returns to Hannibal, and is very quickly thrown out of his church and sets up shop across the river. These connections are everywhere, but that they get to sort of decide, we're not going to be interested in abolition right now. We're going to withdraw to the countryside. We're going to have our very legitimate family issues and challenges. We're going to decide when we re-enter this, compared to not just their Black relatives, but just in general, Black Philadelphians, where the challenge, we can center abolitionism, but please don't talk about voting rights and marriage and all these other sorts of things. But then what I found really striking is, the war is ended and they have these 2 sisters living in South Carolina still, and they know the varied family they have there, but they make sure to send one of their friends with linens and medicine for their sisters who have held the line the whole time.
Yeah.
It's such a fascinating position to be in, where they get to kind of choose the terms of their engagement. And there's a lot of that in there. So I wonder if you could sort of talk about like who in here gets to pick and choose their moments and who is just in it.
Yeah, that's a good observation. So Sarah and Angelina Grimke were really, I mean, they spend the late, basically 1837, 1838, traveling across New England, giving speeches about women's rights and the need for emancipation. And then Angelina gets married to Theodore Weld. And within about a year, Angelina sort of collapsed. She got very sick. And after her marriage, the couple moves with Sarah, her older sister, to the countryside in New Jersey. I saw some people saying they were from New Jersey in this chat. And when they moved to New Jersey, they basically turned to farming. They became very much involved in all of these reform movements that are running throughout the 1840s and 1850s.
You've got all the best ones in there. Millerites,
yes.
Graham.
Oh yeah, Sylvester Graham. They join briefly, flirt with the idea of the Millerites and the end of the world. And Angelina proceeds to have 3 children, very difficult pregnancies, and just accommodating and relating to being a mother. In our modern terms would probably say severe postpartum depression and postpartum, medical issues. But of course, it's the 1840s. Nobody knows that. And so the sisters and Theodore retreat into the countryside with their children. And they did run a school, a very, very progressive school for children of reformers. So William Lloyd Garrison's children attended the school, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's relatives, and all these things. And so they are committed in terms of reform, but their ability and willingness, when their lives they became kind of overwhelmed with child rearing and living and health, their ability to set aside their obligations to or relationships as they existed very tenuously with the Black community for their own way was very striking. It was sort of as if every moment in the Grimke sisters' lives, when they were confronted with their own individual trying times in life, it was like, oh, we're going to withdraw and we're going to redo reform on our own terms. In their school, although the school that they ran was very famous, for all records of it, was well run, excellent education. It was integrated, both male and female, and Black and white. So they were kind of at the top of their reform game in terms of that respect. They also were very much still hesitant to interact with Black people who were unlike Black people who they thought Black people should be. So for instance, they opened their school in New Jersey to African-American students, and yet they were very in their private letters sort of wary if the Black person was not in some way related to Black people that they already knew, right? Or that they already knew about, or that the Black person people they knew. Whereas with the white students, they were very much, anyone who's into reform, this is your place, right? This is your sort of school in the countryside. So their ability to withdraw, and also, the scene you mentioned at the end of the Civil War, the Grimke sisters, 2 older sisters, were still alive, still living about a block up from the house they had all lived in as children, still until the fall of the Confederacy claimed ownership and enslaved people. Still supported the Confederacy. Of course, the Confederacy falls, and these 2 sisters are immediately, living in poverty. The 2 sisters never denounce slaveholding or the Confederacy, kind of dig in their heels and die proclaiming that, the South was righteous. And Sarah and Angelina, at the end of the Civil War, send a friend of theirs, a fellow abolitionist, down to sort of make sure they're doing okay, give them, some food from the North, and sort of give them sort of salutations to see how they're doing. And one of the things that struck me about that is that there's no mention in all this correspondence that they have with these 2 sisters of the hundreds of enslaved people that those 2 sisters still owned legally until the 1860s. And so it's all of these sort of glaring moments in the Grimke sisters' lives, in their interaction with the political turmoil around them, in which they could have, and I give a lot of counter examples of people in their situation who took the opposite route, they could have engaged further in a very radical way with the racial and political circumstances of their times. And instead, they withdrew in a way that privately they talk about struggling with understanding, how the sin of slavery is affecting themselves, right? Which is very different than saying the sin of slavery, how it's affecting actually enslaved people.
Yeah, it was fascinating for a book that is sort of theoretically about people raised Episcopalian, transformed by this Quaker experience. Although this will, if anyone has lofty ideas about Quaker anti-slavery views, like this book will cure you of that.
Mhm.
And then you have some Unitarians, like the emphasis on sin, but in such a different way from even the framings of the second inaugural, where it's understood as like this is a national sin. And there's a lot of language of sin and repentance. And you have a wonderful line. We have a couple of really great ways of phrasing it, that the Grimke sisters see Black people as either a cause to be won or a sin for which they must atone.
Yes.
That it's always about them. And actually some of the early discussions of Sarah Grimke, who, provides this puzzling example of, the rest of her siblings at the time are all in on this. Her brother Henry is exceptionally sadistic, and she, has these deeply emotional reactions that she then uses to kind of lionize herself and show her atonement, that end up enacting further harm on the enslaved people that she is around.
Mhm.
This concept of sin emerges as such a self-centered thing in this narrative in a really powerful way. And it does remind me of some of the ways we look at Sam Clemens, that he has never engaged in structural reform. He is going to fund Warder McGuinn's law degree, and he talks very much about repentance and what we owe, but only if people enact a very particular kind of behavior that he himself has not kind of enacted. So I wondered if you could kind of draw this metaphor of sin out a little more, in particular, the way it is, that frankly, white women's tears as a form of penance end up being really harmful.
Yeah, so that's a great way of looking at it. I mean, the idea that white reform circles, particularly in the 19th century, having all this talk about the sin of slavery, and the way that they're constructing that conversation, many of them, not all, I think the exception would be somebody like a John Brown, the way that they're constructing that discussion is that it is a sin that is sinful to the people, the core, the morality, the Christian ethos of the nation. And therefore, as Angelina would say in her writings and allude to, slavery is just as damaging to white people as it is to Black people. The problem or the difficulty with making that statement, particularly at their time, is that they were the owners of, hundreds of enslaved people. They themselves were able to move and leave the South and become activists based on the labor and the sale of, those enslaved people. And they never, despite the way that they would talk about the enslaved people with a lot of compassion, particularly Sarah, they never understood that their actions, there was a lot that they actually could have done, right, as slaveholders, that they actually saw other people in their same situation do. One of the things I do when I talk about Charleston in the book is point out that Charleston was a notorious slave society in which white men having children with enslaved women was very well documented, very common, and that many of those white men did make this decision that they were going to send their Black children away, right? Regardless of what the state said, regardless of what their family said, that they had some type of ability of looking at the slave system and saying that they were going to free, manumit, relieve their family members. The Grimke sisters didn't do that, despite the fact that there are many examples right in their church and right in their neighborhood where that happened. And in terms of this idea of the white women's tears, the idea that particularly the Grimke sisters, like many white women's rights activists of their time, had a very difficult time recognizing that enslaved Black women were women. It's kind of this way that they talked about Black women, was that Black women were either enslaved or they were these people that were, ruined, their virtue was ruined, quote unquote, by the slave system. When it came to talking about Black women as kind of sisters in early feminist discourse, that was something that they didn't come to really talk about until the Black women they were around confronted them on it, the Fortin sisters and the other Black women they encounter. And then it was still, they were still like very, very fascinated by the fact that these Black women read and spoke and read the same things they did and had all these political opinions that they also had. The other thing that I saw the sort of manifestations of this was in the way they would then reacted to their nephews. Their Black nephews was very much that we're going to generously provide for these nephews, right? We are going to absolve our family of their sin by providing for our nephews. At the same time that they're doing that, they're paying for the sons, two of the brothers, to attend Harvard for Archie, Princeton for, or attempt to pay for Princeton for Frank. At the same time they're doing that, they really have all of these judgments about the young man's morality, about judging their Blackness, judging their relationship with their mother, who was still enslaved. And they tended to still see themselves, the Grimke sisters tended to still see themselves as having a right to dictate to Black people the terms of their freedom and the terms of their existence in a way that then carried into the next generation in very harmful ways.
Yeah. And thinking about it sort of makes me think the way that Sarah in particular, it's almost framed as well, the feelings themselves. She's had emotions, and those are that's the absolution she needs, that she's had these feelings. And in fact, what's really wonderful about the book, and it's a sort of thing where I got to the point where all points converge. You're tracing these very different families. I was drawing my own little family trees in my book, and then all of a sudden, like, you're feeling them come together. And so watching the Grimke sisters kind of like use their feelings as their way to launch themselves on this career, and with full knowledge of what is happening back home with the rest of their family, and the explicit choices they make, that then that they have been absolved and they can then render these judgments on their family. What was particularly, I really just was struck by it because it's such a strange thing, is their deep concern that Archie and Frank, that their Southern heritage will cause them to sin and all of this other kind of stuff. But the way that collides with their kind of unwillingness to confront the fact that both newly freed and sort of born free Black Americans like have experience as workers, but also have the same desires to be intellectuals and to get to choose where they want to go. A lot of this kind of starting at the bottom, hard work, the places that Frank and Archie end up in their teen years, where their mother says like they could have learned shoemaking trades from their own relatives. They didn't go north to do this kind of stuff. So that's kind of where the third part of the book ends up, is in this discussion of, it's another moment of, okay, can you live out these values in any way in supporting these nephews? And I wonder if you can talk a bit about the way that Frank and Archie kind of really struggle in this immediate postbellum framework for Black advancement, so to speak.
Yes, so very good. So Frank and Archie were born in Charleston to an enslaved woman named Nancy Weston. The story that the white Grimkes told themselves and that Nancy in turn adopted was that she was enslaved to the Grimke sisters' brother Henry, that Henry somehow became this kind master, and that Nancy had these 3 sons by this white man, and that he could not free them before he died in 1852 when Archie was and Frank and their were toddlers, and when Nancy was pregnant with their youngest brother, John. So that's the narrative, right, that the family had about themselves, including the Black Grimkes. The historical record, however, was that Henry, the white father of the Grimke brothers, was very well documented, very sadistic, very cruel. He causes the brain damage of an enslaved man by continuously banging the man's head against walls throughout their childhood, resulting in his permanent, mental health issues. And this was something that the family knew, that they talk about in letters with one another. And so by the time the Civil War ended, Henry has long since died. His sons are alive. And the Grimke sisters read about them in the National Anti-Slavery Standard. So what happened immediately after the Civil War, the Union Army took control of Charleston. Frank and Archie spent the majority of the war hiding from doing battle with their half-brother, Henry's white son, who returned to the South and basically brutalizes his younger black brothers, almost to the point of killing them physically. And so the Civil War ended. The boys are now young teenagers. Their younger brother is, early adolescence. And Nancy Weston, their mother, goes to the abolitionists who are stationed in Charleston, the Pillsburys, who are from New England, and tells them she wants her sons to go to the North. And the Pillsburys arrange for Archie and Frank to be taken to Massachusetts, where they promise they'll be sent to good foster families. Immediately, Nancy discovers that when they're sent to these foster families, they're assigned to like manual labor on these farms in southeastern Massachusetts. They aren't given automatic contact with the education that she wanted them to get. And so she, through her sons, demands that they be sent to Lincoln University or to some other place to learn. And so that's how they ended up at Lincoln. That's how they ended up being talked about in the National Anti-Slavery Standard. And that's how the white Grimke sisters discover that they exist. The issue with that story is that it would have to, and I allude to this a lot in the book, it would have to take a lot of cognitive dissonance for the white Grimke sisters to believe that somehow Henry Grimke, their very violent brother, who they both talked about, did not have a very coercive and violent relationship with enslaved women. They grew up around that in their household. They talked about it amongst each other, right?
Yeah, Sarah talks about Henry is like one of the people she cites in her own stuff.
Yes, in their own narrative, American slavery as it is, their iconic text. They're talking about Henry. They mention him, beating people and sexually assaulting enslaved women. So they know this is who he is. And yet the way they then interact with the products of this sexually violent, coercive, if not, a rape situation with Nancy Weston, the product of that, these 3 Black boys, is the Grimke sisters' immediate reaction is that those boys are going to carry forth the Grimke name, right? Grimke sisters' story is, well, the white Grimke blood is soiled because of slavery. You, my young friends, I'm paraphrasing, but it's basically what she says, are now going to carry the family name forward. And in doing that, the Grimke sisters, they have this idea of what Black people should be in their mind as white reformers, with no understanding or no willingness or desire to understand that these young boys are actually people. They already knew how to read and write because their mother scraped together money to send them to the only school in Charleston that would teach young Black children. They already had kind of ideas of what they wanted to be. They go to Lincoln. They're extremely bright. They attended Lincoln University in rural Pennsylvania. They literally are building themselves up by their bootstraps. And all that the Grimke sisters can say to them in letters is, you need to learn how to manage your money, right? You need to apply yourself more, right? at one point, there's all these arguments about where they will go to school, right? And Archie mentions Harvard because he knows that his Uncle Weld family and all the Welds and his cousins went to Harvard. And they say, well, no, you need to go to another school, but don't go to black school, right? And so everything the Grimke brothers do, the white Grimke sisters are constantly picking at it. And it's like they have a right to dictate the terms of freedom under which the boys live, even though they were absent and complicit in the enslaved lives that produced them. And so my argument in the book is that by the time the Grimke sisters died, they had these 3 nephews. Archie ended up going to Harvard Law School, becoming a very, very famous attorney in Boston, becoming a newspaper editor, very, very involved in politics, and eventually being appointed the ambassador to the Dominican Republic. So that's Archie's story. Frank is equally as successful, goes to Princeton. Unlike his brother, he refuses to accept money from the Grimke family because he says, his exact quote is, "I do not believe they understand the ways of colored people," right? So I'm going to stop accepting their support. Goes to Princeton and eventually becomes minister to the 15th Street Presbyterian Church in DC, the most prestigious Black church in DC, if not the nation. So they've succeeded. But the question is, like, what does that success look like? How did they internalize not just their enslavement and the fact that they grew up in this Charleston slave society in which they were constantly being told they were Grimkes, which had this huge cachet in Charleston at the time, and in some places still does, and yet they were enslaved. And so what did that actually do to the way they then interacted with the world? And one of the things I argue in the book is that Archie and Frank are just as likely and as prone to absorb the hierarchies of their aunts as their aunts were to absorb their lives. So Archie, for instance, goes to work in the Dominican Republic, and all of the things he says about the Dominican Republic reflect all of the things that the Grimke sisters would say about Black people. You know, I wish they could just learn how to govern themselves, but they never will, right? Oh, you know, they're at it again, those crazy Dominican peasants. If they would just let the US come in and interfere with Dominican Republic, things would be fine. So he's talking the exact same way about people who I say in the book look remarkably like him, right? Frank does a similar thing. He's the pastor of this church. He builds the church up. The church does a lot of charity work in Washington, D.C. And yet the way he reacts to the Black community, again, which both Archie and Frank believed, just like the Grimke sisters believed, that they were fundamentally uplifting. The way that they refer to that community as lazy, as backwards, as not working hard enough, is the same sort of language. And the heartbreaking thing is that they, just like the Grimke sisters, really genuinely believe that what they are doing is a salvation, right?
It's just it's just constantly unfolding, and there are these wonderful moments deep in the book that echo back. And I'll just like leave you with one that I found deeply powerful. And I know people have tons of questions, but Sarah's obsession with the idea that the boy's presence has caused her sister's physical decline.
Yes.
That the mere presence of these Black people are in deep emotional and physical proximity to her. And it just made me think of very early in the book when you're talking about some of this earliest language about the danger of Black people around slave owners, that they sort of feel not quite a contagion, but that there's almost a miasma, like having to be too close. And that's a huge part of kind of early Caribbean slave culture stuff. But to see Sarah so explicitly frame things this way, that they have caused this psychic disruption for her sister, who has had a litany of other things that is clearly causing her a lot of trauma, and to localize it in these 2 boys who have endured already a decade and a half of trauma in their own lives, was really a striking moment of seeing how easy it is for this pair who have been lionized to, when push comes to shove, just revert right back. How do you unlearn these things? Well, one of the questions your book asks, I think, is sort of, how hard did they even try?
Yep.
Most of the time. So there are so many fascinating threads. Anyone who has any interest in so many of these different aspects of US history and culture, and thinking about colonialism and all sorts of other stuff, you will get a ton out of this book. I can't wait to go back and revisit parts of it and use it to enrich the work that we do at the museum. So I'll just pull up, I saw a bunch of questions that were also things that were interesting to me, that I know you'll want to talk about. And I'll start with a really good question from April, which I think you will have a lot to say. Did the Grimkes receive inherited wealth from their father or derive any financial benefit from their South Carolinian family?
Yes. So this was harder to come by because the Grimke sisters, of course, story about themselves was that they left penniless and they didn't receive any support. When they left South Carolina, the sisters were disowned publicly by their family. However, they continued to write and correspond with their mother and their sisters and their brothers. And when their father, the senior Grimke, died, each of the girls received from the selling of enslaved people an inheritance that was put in their name, and that they then Sarah took with her to support herself in Philadelphia. They then, throughout their lives, Sarah then managed her money by investing it in different, free labor sources. But that initial pot of money, which was a considerable source of money, so that she could move from Philadelphia, and I point out in the book, moving from Charleston, living in Philadelphia on her own, moving in with her sister, who also gained her wealth from her husband who owned slaves and her father. This is inherited wealth from slave trading and slave owning. That's how people in the South made money, right? And so the Grimke sisters, while it is true they were disowned by their family very publicly, they were still in contact with that family over the years, and they still lived off of the profits from all of that wealth that accrued over time, right? And so yes, they did end up getting a substantial amount of money. When their brother died, both of their brothers died, who also earned their wealth from the family's slaveholding. Sarah got some of that money as well. That was directly derived from slaveholding and slave trading in the South. So yes.
Yeah, and there's a wonderfully poignant and horrible moment where I think it's Archie, that one of the strikes against him as he seeks to marry this woman that he loves, is that through no fault of his own, he doesn't have any inheritance to bring to this. And it's sort of like, well, we all understand why. And it's like, it's a fixable thing. It's theoretically, this is that area where you could do a thing, and you're choosing not to. And there are examples of people who make different choices.
Yes.
And there's another question that is a really important parallel, and I know there's a lot in the book about this. Donna asks, essentially, did white women in the South actually have ownership of slaves? Could they own property? So there's some coverture stuff here and some kind of white women slave owner stuff here.
So there's been a lot of work done on this. Hannah Jones Rogers, brilliant historian, she came up with a beautiful book called They Were Her Property. It's all about slaveholding white women in the South, and it's one of the sources that I turn to a lot. A historian called Chakrabarty Myers, who did a lot of work on specifically Charleston and Black women and their relationship with white men in the South. So white women could own through ways of manipulating the law, in which they could inherit slaves. They could, on behalf of males and their families, buy and sell slaves. But this was a marketplace, as Hannah Jones Rogers pointed out, in which white women engaged in. It's not as if white women were, again, traditional argument, going back to the 1960s, like, oh, well, white women were just as victimized by slavery as enslaved people because they couldn't actually own slaves. Not necessarily true. In terms of ownership in the sense that we know now, no. In terms of being able to dictate the terms of you're a very, very wealthy white woman in the South, that wealth is derived from slaveholding and slave trading, you marry, that then goes into your family that you're raising, and you have certain rights to the sale and negotiation of those people. That did exist. And so those who are interested in this, again, I'd point to They Were Her Property, an excellent book. It goes through literally all of the court records in this. The legal aspects of this are that women could become, underneath the law, defined in a certain way that would give them rights to certain aspects of property. So yes, white women could engage and did engage in the slave trade and in slave holding. And in fact, the Grimke sisters' mother was notorious, again, for being a particularly cruel slaveholder and slave trader, and has conversations with her daughters about, well, after her husband dies, she basically owns the estate. And so she sells, 10 enslaved people at the drop of a hat because she wants a bigger house on Cumming Street in Charleston. So this is not something that is foreign or new kind of in terms of historiography. I think what is interesting is the ways in which that then plays out in families, particularly when the Grimke sisters' feminism was built upon the idea that slavery had become kind of a sin to white women, when in actuality, many of the women they were talking to and conversing with could have and did engage in the slave trade and slaveholding.
Yeah, and I think one thing that Donna may have sort of been getting at, which you talk about extensively here, and I think you cite, I dropped the link to They Were Her Property in because I could find that quickly. But I know you called, you sort of state by name Thavolia Glymph. And I think the other aspect of this is the buying, the selling, the negotiating. In no world were white women not allowed to use this property. And that is actually the, Polly Grimke, like, is a notorious figure in here. And Henry must be terrible when even she at times sort of says you're a horrible person. That the just as a white woman didn't own the house that she lived in, but was still understood to be running the house. It's made really clear.
Very clear that, Polly Grimke, the mother, I mean, she basically ran all of the houses that they owned. So they owned multiple houses, including their family plantation, one of the main plantations out in the countryside. And Polly was put in charge of running that household. That was her role. And she did it with, she locked up the food because she believed that slaves were hungry and that they were stealing food. And so she didn't allow slaves to eat. She was particularly brutal to enslaved women, forcing them to stand for all hours of the day, very, very sort of cruel things that are encountered and talked about in the Grimke letters just as a casual thing, right? Which would seem to indicate, that Polly Grimke is not suffering as a slaveholding white woman. She is, and she's not a victim. She instead is victimizing. And I point to, the writings of Harriet Jacobs. If you read Harriet Jacobs, who was a friend of the Grimkes and the Fortons, and actually related to one of the Fortons, she talks about this all the time in her depiction of slavery. The woman who owns Harriet Jacobs, is notoriously cruel and will starve enslaved people because she can. That's how white women in this situation would exert power, right? The people they had power over were the enslaved people.
Yeah, as someone whose grandparents retired to a very small town in North Carolina, boy, do Hertford and Edenton, North Carolina, loom very large in these histories. To see Pasquotank and Perquimans showing up, and I think any of you who have been to some of our other programming on Twain, like some of this is going to sound familiar. And I think one of the really powerful things in here, we talk a lot about sort of Sam's struggle with nostalgia. What do you do when many of the happiest memories of your childhood are the worst memories of somebody else's? And Sam telling stories about his mother that he means as a demonstration of what a caring person she was. Mm-hmm. And they're really a demonstration of the ways that she avoided thinking about the violence she was enacting on enslaved boys that she was renting from someone else. So like, this is a thing that we've sort of thought and talked about a lot at the museum. So those are I think that's what's really interesting in this, in the continued relationships between the Grimkes. Like, it was fascinating. There was one point where we were like, oh, and of course they were sending letters back and forth during the war. You know, that there are moments of real family disavowal in here, and it's not it's not in the main white Grimke family. It's really fascinating. So April was asking what happened to the third less famous Grimke nephew.
Excellent question. So one of the things, what was most heartbreaking to me about, so there were three Grimke brothers. The youngest brother's name was John. John, when the Grimke sisters discovered their nephews, John was a teenager, and they agreed to pay for him to attend Lincoln University, where his brothers attended. For whatever reason, the Grimke sisters latched on to an idea that in the historical record, I could find no evidence of this idea being true, but their idea was that something happens where they say that John is unworthy of their charity. Those are exact words of Sarah Grimke, right? Something, he's not bright enough. He's lazy. They accuse him of absorbing all of the characteristics of their brothers, his white uncles. And so they stop supporting him. And what that meant for this kid, of course, is that he has no ability to pay for school, right? And so he drifts along for a little while. He ended up in a life that was not at all connected to his brothers. There's evidence he ends up eventually in New York City, where he kind of put on the idea of being a gentleman of color. And then people would discover and ask, are you a Grimke related to these Grimkes? And he would then, have to say yes or no, or like disappear. He worked as a waiter, but he would, for whatever reason, the Grimke sisters had this narrative that there was something wrong with him, right? That he had failed. Again, there's no actual evidence of this being true. In fact, his grades at Lincoln are, the same as his brothers, A's and B's. So my question is always, and when I did another talk, somebody said, well, was it because he looked, he had more African-American features than his brothers did? Was it because he was younger? And perhaps had a different relationship with Nancy, their mother, than the older brothers did. I don't know what it was, but he was sort of labeled as being a failure, even by Archie and Frank, so much so that by the time he died penniless and alone in a boarding house in New York City, without, as far as I know, having any children or family of his own.
That's interesting, because as you say, it's sort of this strangely subversive thing that they could blame his failure not on his Blackness, but on what is inherited from the people that they know. Yes. But you described it as charity. He's unworthy. Like, he is their family.
Yes.
That we're talking about a family where Sarah acts as a mother to these children, at times more than Angelina. This is the 19th century, aunts and mothers. It all works that way. And that they could use essentially that inheritance from their sinful white siblings. But Angelina and Theodore's own children, have failure and are never cast off in those same ways. So this strange way of explicitly acknowledging the blood relationship as a way to cut out this one corner of the family is some real mental gymnastics in a century that already sets new standards for that kind of stuff.
Exactly. Yep.
It's incredible stuff. So let's see, we have one more. So April says here, do you believe being color struck remains a significant part of our generational trauma today?
I do. I think color struck in terms of definitely the Grimke brothers had a lot of ways that they struggled with being Black leaders and really embracing that. And it wasn't that they were ashamed that, I think we kind of get into this idea, so and so is ashamed of being Black. It wasn't sort of that simple. It was more that they were very much drawn to this myth of racial respectability, right? And if only working class Black people would get their act together, racism would go away, right? Very popular kind of idea then as now, right? And because they believed that, and they had so much shame about their past, about enslavement, about their mother, being the victim of, sexual assault repeatedly by their white father, that they then had so much shame that the way they enacted that shame was to treat their poorer, often darker skinned Black people in very disparaging and horrible ways, right? And again, tracing the language, what was fascinating to me, again, them using the exact same language that the Grimke sisters used to talk about Black people in Philadelphia, to talk about Black people in DC, right? And, you know, having, but not seeing, again, that dissonance, not seeing it as something that's problematic, seeing it as something as, well, we're the leaders in this society, we are speaking truth, right? And again, this was something that, you know, as I talk about in the book, not to give too much away, but, you know, that really damages their relationship with Archie's daughter. And, you know, nothing that young woman did was ever good enough, because they kind of, you know, everything she did had to be racially respectable.
Yeah. If for no other reason, the introduction to her poetry that is used throughout the book is reason enough for someone unfamiliar to read it. And I'll just end with one question here from that Sean Estelle dropped up here in the chat. Essentially, would you argue, this is forcing you to make a real choice, would you argue the Grimke sisters are doing the work, or is part of the reason we know them is because they got more credit from history about their abolitionist activities than they deserve?
So interesting question. I think that the Grimke sisters did, in speaking before a legislature at a time when women were not allowed to do that, that is a step, it is symbolic, it is a good thing. In writing about slavery, American slavery as it is a brilliant, you know, basically account of what slavery actually was at a time when people sort of sugarcoated what slavery actually was. The issue with the Grimke sisters, however, is that they were never able to move beyond, we are vessels of rescuing white people, white Southerners and white women primarily, from the sins of slavery. And we believe slavery is wrong. And that way of looking at the world, particularly once they were interacting with Black people and with the complexities of what actual rights and freedom look like, that is problematic. And I would say that there are many, and were many, Black women activists of their generation who were actually doing kind of the tough work of that, who I talk about in the book. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for talking about this with me and answering all these wonderful questions. I think Omar's put the link in there a few times. I would encourage anyone who has even now a passing interest in some of these fascinating characters to pick it up, because there are 10 times as many interesting people in here and interesting connections to puzzle through, and familiar places that will be recast for you through this story. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, and enjoy, everybody.
And we will make sure that I think, Omar, if I send it to you, we can mention some of the books that Kerri has alluded to in this.
Yes.
We can put those in the post-show email so that people have them as well, but they're all footnoted very well.
Yeah.
Yes, we can have that. And I also just want to remind folks that we're going to have a lot of programming coming up at the museum. So please go on our website or our social media to check out what we have coming up, both in person and virtual. A lot of holiday programming from our educational programs. Thank you so much, Kerri and Erin, and have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you, Erin. Wonderful questions. Thank you,
you.
Omar.